Hey everyone, name's Dr. Kyle Degle with Neurosolutions Center of Dubai, and today I am looking so forward to something I've been waiting for a long time. And we have here today Dr. Genevieve from Brisbane, Australia with Nurturing Brain. And first of all, just thank you so much for making the long trip to Dubai.
Oh, it's been an amazing time in Dubai. I can't believe it.
All right, so let's get started here. So could you just kind of talk about, what you do in your practice in Australia?
Okay, so Nurturing Brain Potential is a functional neurology centre, and what we basically do is bring hope and potential to our clients that come in through our doors. What we want to do is offer hope and to say that we never, ever, ever have a ceiling on hope, and that we want to get every child that comes in, an adult, their full potential.
So let's talk about that. So what is your demographic of patients?
Okay, so I see a lot of clients with traumatic brain injuries, but I have to say my special favourite is nonverbal autistic kids. The moment you hear them speak, the moment you hear the mum say, they've told me I love you, that is just magical. As every mum, what you want to hear is your child's voice. To be denied that is massive. It's such a tragic situation. And the thing is that a lot of these mums that come in, mums, dads, caregivers, are told this is the way it is. This is how it's got to be for a long time.
And that's an interesting topic because this is something really huge here in the Middle East, is that a lot of parents are being told that your child has autism, and this is just what autism is, right? Your child is going to be put into this label, but there's really not much out there in regards to actually, what's going to happen, right? Because this kid actually speak. So let's talk about that. So when you take a child who's on the spectrum, and what do you do?
All right, so we're looking at it from a developmental neurology point of view. So we're looking from bottom up. So the thing is, a lot of the times with autism, it's not anything like wrong in the brain, there's no lesions, but what it is there's glitches in the brain. So my job as a functional neurologist is to find out with this child, what is it that's stopping them from speak? And every child's different, so you don't know what that journey entails until you have a look. The other thing that we offer is hope. I had a mum that came in that was told her 2.5-year-old was never going to talk, was going to be intellectually disabled. So when she came in, the first thing she did, she sat with crossed arms, was really uptight and very, very, very skeptical. The thing I said to her is that we do not limit that child. What we want to do is find out how we can find his hidden voice. And we had him speaking sentences in 4 weeks. His journey was incredible. He's a happy boy in school and he doesn't shut up now.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the glitches. So what are some glitches that you're seeing within these kids?
So the main problem that we see is the retained primitive reflexes. So that's our start and that's our go-to. And the other thing that we see is that a lot of these kids are coming in dialing in fight flight. Their ventral vagal system hasn't descended, it hasn't developed properly. So these kids are unable to self-regulate, self-soothe, self-calm. So they're expected to sit in a corner and be quiet. But neurologically, they're unable to do so because the vagal system hasn't developed. Now, the retained primitive reflexes, they're holding them back. So what I say to the kids is that, if you ride a bike, when you started riding, you had training wheels. So when you have training wheels, you can't ride fast, you can't do tricks. The thing is that once we remove the training wheels, you can do amazing things. So I tell the kids that do understand that this is the training wheels of your brain. So retained reflexes are holding you back. They're not allowing your brain to flourish or to develop or to do the things that they're supposed to do. Once we fix that, once we start to look at that area there and remove the obstacles, then your brain is phenomenal.
It's amazing that, especially the analogy that you've used. And again, I appreciate you for this week. You trained my staff and my staff was just so incredibly grateful. So I appreciate you for that. So, on my behalf, it's really interesting. So, I come at this from a traumatic brain injury perspective. And the first thing I always want to do is look at the brain. So from doing EEGs of the brain, right? So we're looking at the brain waves.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing is actually something very unique. Is we're seeing certain patterns inside the brain where we're seeing a lot of hyperactivity, so a lot of like high brain waves, and then we see these low brain waves in certain areas of the brain. And so when we get these kids that are nonverbal, what I'm finding is that there's two speech centers, right? So there's this area called Broca's and another area called Wernicke's. And if these kids are nonverbal, we see a very low brainwave. It's almost like if the kid was actually asleep. So we consider that like delta waves. And so what we've been doing is actually finding these networks, and we've been doing treatment, neuromodulating, whether it's using stuff like lasers or even sound waves over the brain to turn it on. So I really like your approach. But so so how would I, as a therapist out there who's listening, what is a primitive reflex?
So a primitive reflex is basically a survival reflex that when a child's born, if you look at a baby and you see how they're helpless, they don't do much, in that first year of life, it's critical. You see that child goes from doing nothing to actually standing, walking, and that brain development in that first year of life is critical. So these reflexes are there for a reason. So they help us with the survival. So they're helping us see the world, see how we go with that. But when they're retained, it stops the brain from developing certain areas. So the kids that come in, if they have retained reflexes, we're seeing that there's an unevenness of skills. They can do something really, really well and something's not so well. So these reflexes are basically holding them back from developing to their full potential. The other thing that's important is that they've been told these reflexes are retained and you can't do much about it. But what we say is the brain's neuroplastic. So if we know how to stimulate the brain, and with your mentorship, like I found when I worked with you in Amsterdam, that when I went home, I could fast track these retained reflexes using photobiomodulation, using sensory motor input, using Resimax, a variety of tools to basically get the brain to start to get above threshold. What happens is with a lot of physical therapy is that they're doing the great stuff and they're doing the retained reflex exercises, but we're not getting above threshold. And what I learned from you, especially in Lake Charles, is that if we co-activate, if we start using other ways to wake up the brainstem, we get results so much quicker. And we get those retained reflexes integrating the fastest way possible.
So what are some common primitive reflexes that you see in these kids that are nonverbal?
So the main three ones that you taught me were the rooting reflex, the palmar reflex, which is in the hands, and the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex, the ability to cross the midline. Now, what happens with the rooting reflex is that if that's retained, it means that the child can't really feel their lips, they can't feel movements of their tongue. It makes a massive difference to them. What happens with the medical world and the physical therapist, nothing wrong against that, is they perceive that speech is coming through the muscles of the mouth and they're looking at working on that. Speech is actually in the brain. So we need to look at all areas. We can't just look at the muscles. We can't just let's just do rooting reflex. We have to look at the whole brainstem. So when we do integration with the reflexes, we're doing rooting reflexes with exercises, with lasers. We're doing the palmar reflex. We do all the reflexes that we measure in the first place to see if they're retained. And then we work on those reflexes. The difference with us and learning from you is co-activation. By co-activating and doing various things, you really get results so much quicker.
It's interesting about the rooting reflex. I have had some parents that have brought their kids to get MRIs, right? Because they were maybe thinking maybe there's a tumor in the brain or something in the brain. And I had a very unique discovery years ago that what I started noticing was that the sinuses actually started having things called mucosal thickening, which is basically inflammation, and then even something called opacification, so it was whiteness. That made me wonder if the brain's like a keyboard, it's going to take all this information. Could an actually sinus issue be contributing to a neurological issue? So we started doing nasal swabs of these autistic kids and stool samples. And what we found is they have an incredible amount of abnormal bacteria. So we call that dysbiosis. But the big thing is I started seeing specific things like ochratoxin A, which is actually a fungus that comes from aspergillus. And then when I started doing research over aspergillus and ochratoxin A, I started seeing that it was impacting the dopamine receptor in the brain. So the brain chemical that's used for coordination. So then on top of that, the EEGs over these speech areas, they were underactive. So I started wondering, I was like, maybe these networks in the brain, they're underactive because either they had a retained reflex or there could have been an underlying infection or something called pathology that was also even targeting these networks in the brain. So we found that if we get these kids on a diet modification, right? These kids love buttery noodles, crackers, pizza, chips, candy. All those are carbs that feed into bad bacteria and fungus. So I had this idea that maybe there was a gut-brain connection, which we see this prevalently in autism. But I really think one of the missing links is the sinus brain health as well. And it was an interesting concept. But I want to go back to this one question you mentioned earlier. You mentioned the polyvagal theory. And if you don't mind, could you kind of explain a little bit about what this is and then even the vagus nerve on how it impacts the brain?
All right. So when we were studying at uni, we were told there was part of the nervous system was your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest, heal, digest, which everyone knows about. Then there's your sympathetic system, your fight, flight. The one thing that we learned with the polyvagal theory with Stephen Porges is that there's another system called the ventral vagal system. Now, this system is developed. So between 12 to 18 months, when a child's looking at mum, they're looking at mum and going, hey, is mum good? Is mum happy? Is mum stressed? And by doing that, there's a connection with looking at mum, facial expression, noticing that's facial expression, and that leads to regulation. So the majority of the kids that come in to see me, none of them have the ventral vagal system working. So they're basically dialing in fight flight. They're coming in, touching things, screaming, having meltdowns because they cannot regulate. Now, the trouble with society is that when they see a child having a tantrum or running around or kicking furniture or doing that, they think it's behavioral. The thing that we realize, it's neurological. They can't help themselves. Because their ventral vagal system hasn't developed, they do not have the ability to self-regulate, self-soothe, and self-calm. Now, when I was a chiropractor, these kids used to annoy the hell out of me because I think they touch my stuff, they're grabbing things, touching everything, and they just were screaming, couldn't regulate. But when you realize it's neurological, not behavioral, that's a massive difference. And that's the message I like to give to my parents. It's not behavioral. So it's not parenting. So what happens is that if we can get the nervous system, the ventral vagal system to descend, we find that these kids can start to calm down, self-regulate, and they do so much better.
Yeah, well, and it kind of answers some of these people might ask, because there's a lot of discrepancy in behavior, right? But I always go back to look at mania, look at bipolar or even schizophrenia, right? These patients are actually having, and we see this with EEGs in the brain, you're seeing overactivity inside the brain, right? So in this thing called the left frontal lobe that controls our executive function, when we scan these kids' brains, we see this thing lit up like a Christmas tree. It's so hyperactive. And it creates this fixation, right? So if a kid wants to play with a toy and he's enjoying that, or even an iPad, and then a parent basically or someone removes that, what happens is the kid freaks out, right? He throws a tantrum. That tantrum could last for hours, even days. And one of the things that what we've seen, clinically is that there's an area inside the brain, the right frontal lobe, we're seeing a lot of underactivity. And that's the part of the brain that's going to deal with self-regulation, right? And we're seeing it underactive in these autistic kids. So parents that are out there and, they're worried about what other people perceive their kids' behavior, or maybe they're doing behavior therapy, really what we need to be looking at is what's going on with the brain waves, right? Because if the brain's underactive in the self-regulation issue, well, then if I teach a kid a coping mechanism, right? If he throws a tantrum, give him an iPad, give him what he wants, that's going to create a reward system. And when we're scanning these kids' brains, we're seeing that the reward system is already overactive, right? So the part of the brain that deals with self-regulation is underactive. So what we've been teaching doctors and, Dr. Jeanne she's amazing and her team, what they do in Brisbane, is that there's ways that you can target this area of the brain to build it up. So that a way, if you do take, iPad or you tell a kid no, if the brain has enough of connections and enough of energy, right, it can self-regulate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's once we start to build up that right frontal lobe. And the thing that we can see as adults is that when we're drinking and our right frontal lobe goes down, then we can't, that's when we tend to do our drunken calls, or because you're going with an emotional response. You're not doing what we call a cortical or a brain response. So for these kids, if you're telling a child that they should be doing this, they do not comprehend and they do not understand, because that part of the brain, the right frontal lobe, is not firing. So all these messages of going in, you should be sitting still, or what the education department's telling them, it's not working because they neurologically cannot regulate their emotional response. The amygdala, the part of the brain, is emotional. So it's an emotional response that when something happens, bang, response goes on. So with the kids, it's not going from 0 to 100. It's like they're going from 80 to 100. So what happens is like taking the iPad away, they're little triggers. Like as soon as that happens, bang, you're at 100%. Whereas for another kid that's quite well regulated, it's a 0 to 100. It takes a lot before that kid reaches to meltdown. So we've got to understand that these kids are stressed, they're dialing in fight flight, that they're finding that it's really easy to trigger the emotional response because the part of the brain that helps dampen that or has logic is not firing.
Yeah, well, we run a lot of labs on all of our patients, and one of the things that what we've been seeing is when we run a blood draw, right, we actually are looking at a neurological panel, and there's an area in the brain called the basal ganglia, and this is going to kind of control how the brain's going to take information in, and the brain has to decide whether to let it go, make an action, or to stop. And there's this receptor, it's called the D2 receptor, that it actually puts the brake on things. So when we see these kids who have crazy, incredible, tantrums or even stimming really bad, when we run these labs, we see that this receptor in the brain that stops everything, calms it down, it's actually having an autoimmune where the immune system is attacking it. And, the question is, well, why? And, when I start checking these kids' sense of smell, these kids actually don't really smell very good. And it's interesting, or maybe we see a deficit between smell in one nostril versus the other. And we can even quantify this by actually watching what happens to their heart rate. It's incredible to see that when you apply a sense to the brain, you can actually see the heart rate changes.
Absolutely.
And most of these kids can't smell out of their right nostril, which is very interesting. And that fires the right frontal lobe. And if the right frontal lobe is weak, it's not going to deal with self-regulation.
And these are the kids that are the picky eaters as well, because they don't have a sense of smell. And the other thing with the basal ganglia that I explained to my parents is that it's like the gas pedal and the brake. So when we're driving a car, we need to have that balance between the brake and the pedal. So with these kids, if they can't have that balance, that's why they flip, because they either all go or brake, and it's really, really hard for that child because those decisions that they're making is not balanced.
Well, let's talk about that, because that's an interesting topic. You brought that up. What about the kid that freezes, right? Okay. So the kid that gets really stressed out and he just shuts down. Talking to some of these parents about, some of the neurological science behind that.
All right. So when we're born, the first one that we start off is what we call the dorsal vagal system. What happens then is that's the freeze response. So that's when you have a deer that's caught in a headlight and they can't move. It's freeze. In development, then we have the sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight flight, and then we have the vent, which shuts down some of that dorsal system. Then we have the vagal system, the ventral vagal system that develops, that shuts down your sympathetic system. Now, with these kids, if they don't have the ventral vagal system, they can't stop these freeze action. So say a child that's selective mutism. It's not that they can't talk. I had a child come in and it was she can talk to her sister, just couldn't talk to her mum. And when you got the history from that mum, it was the time that the mum yelled at this young child. So what the child does is just flips into freeze mode. So it's not that she can't talk, it's the fact that because her brain just cannot cope with it, it just goes into freeze
response.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. Let's talk about some risk factors that could potentially lead up to autism.
All right, it's not one factor more than the other, as you know. It's a lot of different things. So it could be it could be diet, it could be chemical pollutions. The biggest thing I think is, as you mentioned before, is mold exposure. It could be diet, and I think another thing that we need to look at is the lack of movement. Kids aren't moving much at all today, even toddlers. It's for safety, we tend to pin them up. We're not letting them run around as much. We're putting them in pens, putting them in front of the TV, screens. All of that is impacting development. They're not doing the regular things like climbing, so they don't get to crawl at the age that they should be crawling. Developmentally, there's a delay with the motor development. Then they're not walking at the age they should be walking. They should be upright and walking at 12 months. If there's any delay in that, that tells me that the brain hasn't developed in the timeline that it should do.
Yeah. And this is just for the parents out there listening. I want to talk about this. I've seen NICU babies, right? One of the things that happen is if this kid comes out and they have to put a bunch of adhesive tape on the kid's, face for, respiratory issues, that could actually cause some small little trauma and stress response to the face. So that child is going to eventually develop into the colic baby, the kid that's literally spitting up everything. And, you need your facial muscles to be able to, hold your food down, to be able to properly chew and suck. So kids that don't latch on for breastfeeding, right? Those are kids that if the brain's not basically getting this input from the face and the tongue, then you can create underdevelopment. And then that translates into something that I'd like for you to talk about is the nasolabial folds, the lines on the face, about how important that is. When I see a child, my wife and I, she sees the beautiful little baby, and then I look at the dysfunctions between the facial tone.
That's exactly what I do. I read faces and I read kids, and I'm like, oh no, that's not good. Yes. Because when you look at it, the face is a window to the brain. So you can tell so much about someone's facial tone, what they're doing. So with these kids, because there's a lack of development of motor tone in their faces, when they're basically deadpan, you don't see any expression. With the nonverbal kids, they come in what we call a flat face. You don't see any expression, you don't see any emotion. They're basically blank. So what I notice when I start seeing these kids is there's a change of tone in their faces. And I say to my team, hey guys, look at them. They're smiling. We see the nasolabial fold is a very easy way of detecting whether there's tone in the face. Because if you look at that, they should smile and they should have like a little line in that area there that can tell you that that muscle has developed. So these kids come in flat tone, and then we start to see the progression where they start to develop motor tone. The other thing about facial expression is that when we're smiling, the muscles of the face has to move in that certain pattern that tells your brain you're happy. So if you're smiling, your brain can go, okay, I'm happy. We had a client coming in who was 32 years old, nonverbal. The first thing we noticed with him when we started working with him is his facial tone. He's never smiled. He's never cried. As you're working through that development and his tone starts to improve, his mum said, oh my gosh, he's laughing uncontrollably. He's giggling. He's doing all sorts of stuff. And he's feeling emotion properly for the first time in his life at age 32. And his mum said, he's crying uncontrollably. And I said, that's fantastic. Because for the first time in his life, his brain can actually notice what emotion is. So when you look at kids and you know they're deadpan and there's no facial expression, that poor child is going through life in a fog. They're not feeling happy, they're not giggling, they're not laughing, they don't feel sad. So majority of these autistic kids that come in, they cannot relate to their parents crying or their parents feeling sad. They just don't read emotions. So what happens is that they can't relate. So mum says it's really hard when you have a child, you drop them at childcare or daycare, wherever they go, they don't even cry. Like as a parent of a child, you drop them at daycare and they'd be screaming and crying. You go, oh my gosh. But now I look at the mums and I think, how hard is that to be as a mum to not have that child miss you? The other thing with autistic kids is they don't look at you. They have no eye contact. Now, as a mum, that eye contact releases dopamine. I don't know if you know your kids, but sometimes with kids, you just want to I don't know, my son, maybe I'm a bad mom, but I just wanted to kill him. I just wanted to troll him and go, you're just behaving out of control. I don't know, I can't cope with this. And then he turns to me and gives me a smile, and I get a dopamine hit, and I think dopamine is happy hormones, and I get oxytocin, which is a maternal feeling, and I go, okay, I won't kill you today. But for that mum of an autistic child, they don't get that. They don't get that eye contact. They don't get that dopamine hit. They don't get that oxytocin. So for that mum raising that child, it's so, so hard. So when a mum comes in, you have to realize that they're going through a journey that's filled with so many obstacles and challenges. And as a mum, not getting that dopamine hit when your child looks, your child doesn't look at you. Your child isn't aware that you're leaving that child. Your child isn't aware if you're sobbing. They don't get that. You know, with our kids, if I'm crying, my son would come up and go, hey, mum, you okay? You know, they don't get that. So they're on this really hard part and journey because they're not getting the feedback of oxytocin and dopamine.
Yeah, well, you know, I would get a chance to talk to a bunch of amazing speech therapists, and, you know, they speak the lingo, but I'm like, you know, there's 5 cranial nerves that deal with speech. And why aren't you guys looking at these 5 nerves, right? And the one thing I talk to them about is look at these kids' facial tone. Like, do you notice that the little line that goes from here to here, the corner of the mouth, that it's not symmetrical? Yeah. And that's a direct reflection of the brain. The other thing is the tongue, right? If these kids are picky eaters, the question is should you be targeting the different taste receptors in the tongue? Maybe it's the fact that this area of the brain is not getting its stimulation. And then the other thing is the, you know, the networks inside the brain, right? Mm-hmm. The frontal lobe, the Broca's, the Wernicke's that are underactive. So let's talk about some of the ways that you work on the face, you maybe face in the tongue, to try to help these kids that are nonverbal speak.
Okay, so the thing that we look is once we see that they have a lack of motor tone in their face is that we use our tools, Resimax, we use stim pods, we use different modalities to help increase tone in the face. The other thing is a lot of these kids are not nose breathers, they're mouth breathers. So they have lack of tone in their face, they breathe through their mouth, their tongue isn't resting on the top of their mouth. So working with just speech, you need to make sure that the tongue is functioning the way it should do, that the muscle tone is improved around the face, because how are you going to talk if you can't feel your face? So with someone with a lack of tone, they don't really feel their mouth, they don't feel their face, they don't feel their tongue. So tongue stimulation is in a very important way that we can get feedback to the brain and get the tongue firing better. You mentioned smell as well. What we also do is that we use peppermint on the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, and by doing that, you're driving the facial nerve number 7. So it's looking at the way, how do these cranial nerves work? How can we stimulate those cranial nerves to fire up the brain? The trigeminal is the longest nuclei in the brainstem, and that's one that I found when I started, after Lake Charles, when I went back and started actually looking at trigeminal nerve and stimulating it specifically in the face, it increased tone in the face. It helped these kids get to speech a lot quicker because you're working with the brainstem.
Yeah, you know, that was actually when we were working with little kids like anoxic brain injuries, right, and TBI patients. The first thing that we started doing is we weren't working on the arm or the leg that was paralyzed. We started actually looking at the brain and the face, right, because facial tone is a direct reflection of the brain. But when we started reading the research, what was very interesting in the literature was that if you stimulate the trigeminal nerve, you improve blood flow to the brain. So, you know, when I went back and started looking at, well, what's going on, especially in these autistic kids, I found that it was very interesting that the sinuses were actually innervated by the trigeminal nerve. And that same nerve also even innervates the teeth. So a lot of these kids, because of their high sugar carbohydrate diet, they get all these cavities or dental caries in their mouth. And they also have something above, right? They have something going on inside their sinuses. So again, from a theory perspective, was that maybe there was some underlying infections or, you know, maybe mycotoxins, specifically Aspergillus ochratoxin A, that was in the sinuses that was weakening basically the sensory response to the brain. And then there was an infection that was hitting different receptors in the brain. And, that was something that, I've basically kind of ran with. But I see this actually in all the patients from all over. So right now we're actually over 68 countries of kids that are flying in. And every kid so far that's been basically labeled autistic has all tested positive for mycotoxins, which to me, it's alarming. And I've had a couple of patients that didn't test positive. And, the parents were like, well, this is interesting because I hear you talking about this. But what happened is we did a glutathione challenge. So glutathione is this antioxidant that the liver uses. And we did a 3-day glutathione challenge where we gave these kids glutathione to help the liver detoxify. When we did post actually urine samples, even blood, we actually seen the mycotoxin levels popped up. So parents that are out there that are listening, if you tried mycotoxin testing and it came back negative, make sure that you've done the glutathione challenge, because what you're going to see is that a lot of these kids have so much inflammation and this nerve that innervates their liver and kidneys weak, the vagus nerve, and these kids aren't detoxifying properly as well. So sometimes you have to take an additional, nutrient, glutathione, to help the body detoxify. So if you are out there and your child is tested negative for glutathione or negative for mycotoxins, make sure that you rerun that test and do the glutathione challenge, and then you'll see that once you get the liver and kidneys in gear, that they're going to start pumping out more mycotoxins, through the urine or even the blood.
Yeah, I think at the moment, it's such a shame that no one's looking at nasal dysbiosis or looking at the nose, or people are like when I tell my parents about mold, they're like, what? Mold? And they don't think too much about it. But there's a part of the nose that's called the sphenopalatine ganglion, and that basically goes straight to the brain. So so when you have mold and you have issues with mold, is that what happens is this inflammation goes to the brain, and a lot of these conditions and a lot of the kids that are coming in have all got inflamed brains.
Yeah, well, you can actually see this from a parent perspective, right? From a psychiatric issues, anxiety and depression. What I do is I literally evaluate everyone's pupils. And the more the black in the eye, the pupils dilated, the more stressed the brain is, right? So the purpose of the pupils is for the brain to take in light. But when the brain gets into this kind of protective fight or flight, it's going to dilate the pupils so the brain can see this huge threat. And what's happening in these autistic kids is if you actually look at their pupils, they're really massive.
Yeah.
And when they go into like their tantrums, they really get big. And that's actually a sign that the brain's not taking in adequate sensory stimulation. So we really work on actually trying to shrink the pupils, right? And as we shrink the pupils, the brain itself actually starts to calm down. And we can even quantify that from looking at EEGs, because what we're seeing is that if the pupils are dilated, the brain is basically in a high gear. We call that high beta. And when we get the pupils to actually get smaller, we start seeing more theta and alpha waves, which are more self-soothing and self-regulation. And again, I think that, clinically from what I've seen is that a lot of this is triggered by nasal dysbiosis, abnormal bacteria in the sinuses, impacting these networks in the brain, creating psychiatric issues.
I think it's really, there's no simple solution. So where I'm in Brisbane and at Nurturing Brain Potential, like we're known for getting kids to speak. So all the parents are coming in going, oh, Jen, when do you think my child's going to speak? And I said, every child's different. So it depends on what load is on that child, whether it's chemical, emotional. We have to look at the various factors that's going on. It's not an easy solution. There is no, you can just do this and that's going to work. So with every child, we need to assess and go, okay, what is happening in that child's brain? What is going on? What is causing that inflammation in the brain? Is it a gut thing? Is it nasal dysbiosis? Is it exposure to mold? Is it the fact that their sympathetic system, they're still dialing in fight flight, that they can't self-regulate and self-soothe? So there's so many different factors out there, and it's like a puzzle. So when a child comes in, it's looking at, okay, what's going on there? What's working? What's not working? The QEEGs gives you an amazing window of what's going on. We can see with the face, we look at the face and go, okay, that tells me that the right side of the brain isn't working, they haven't got tone. All of that just gives you the complete picture of where we need to start and how we need to go.
Let's talk about photobiomodulation. Let's talk about laser therapy and how it's impacted your patients and, the kind of outcomes that you get.
So with photobiomodulation, which is lasers and light energy. So the thing in our cells, we have a powerhouse called the mitochondria. So what happens is with these kids, if the powerhouse isn't producing enough energy, it can't work like it should. So when we use lasers using light energy to stimulate that mitochondria in the cell to produce more energy. So every part of our body has a certain frequency. So I think the lasers are amazing in the fact that you guys have matched the frequency of light to the frequency of that part of the brain. So when we work in our clinic, if we look at them and we go, okay, their right prefrontal cortex needs driving, we will put on right prefrontal cortex setting on the lasers that you guys have managed to do. And then you'll find we target specific areas with the laser. So we're using light energy, which is very, very safe to stimulate that cell to produce mitochondria to get them firing better.
Yeah, I always like to use people out there, I'm so logical and very scientific, but one big thing I always like to tell parents is Albert Einstein came up with this equation, E equals mc squared. And my logical brain when I read this was that I broke that down into energy equals mass of every cell in the entire body. C squared wasn't just the speed of light, it was the diversity of colors. So when you look at the mitochondria, the question is what kind of light is being exposed to the body? And a predominant kid in autism or a kid with autism is that they really don't go outside in nature. They really don't see a diversity of colors. Their main source of light is really coming from screens, right? Which has actually been quantified into a blue wavelength. And the interesting about blue light is I tell a lot of my parents that, your kid also has kind of like an excessive amount of blue light or even blue light toxicity, which is a whole new term. It's called light pollution. And what happens is blue light at an excessive amount, it actually can suppress the ability to break down carbohydrates, which is what all these kids eat. It also can increase cortisol. So cortisol is the brain chemical that stresses everyone out. And then what happens when you look at the color spectrum, you have blue way over here on the low end and then red way over here on the top end. And you get a lot of red light actually, and even yellow and even violet from being outside in the sun. And a lot of these kids, they actually have vitamin D deficiencies. So you get vitamin D from being out in the sun. So what's happening is you go to a playground, right? And what you don't see is kids playing anymore. Specifically,
That's
even
right.
kids on the spectrum, right? These kids are inside playing on video games. And let's talk about, I always tell parents that, if you use a diversity of color, right? Get your kid to the beach, get your kid out in nature, let your kid go out and explore. I know you love to be outside running in Australia. It's beautiful there. But these kids, what happens is when they go outside, they're not noticing the leaves and the airplanes, right? They might find like a rock to go play in. And what we want the brain to be able to do is to be able to see the world. And what happens is that eventually starts self-regulating these kids, right? Hippotherapy is becoming so huge, right? They're putting kids on animals, on a horse and letting it walk. And what it does is it assembles a natural gait of a human being. So it actually is impacting parts of their brain. But let's talk about like nature and like how impactful it is for the brain.
I think it's so important. I think they've done studies in Japan where they said exposure to green light and walking in a forest does amazing things to your brain. A lot of the kids that come in, due to the society and what we're faced with now, they're not outdoors at all. Like the kids that I see I live in Australia, so everyone should have a tan. But what they're coming in is pale, dark rings under their eyes. These are the kids that are on gaming a lot of the time and they don't like the outdoors. The thing about the light is I say to the parents, like sunrise and sunset is amazing for producing melatonin. So I said, make sure if your kid's an early morning person, why don't you go outside? You don't have to go to different places. You can just go in your backyard, have a picnic in the backyard, during sunrise in the morning, or if your child prefers the night, just go outside in your backyard to do sunset. It's so important to be with nature because that's the thing that's missing. A lot of these kids can't run or they're not into outdoor sports. I mean, we're lucky. We're an amazing country with a lot of outdoor sports, but these kids aren't doing that. And the parents are coming in going, oh, they don't like sports, so we don't do it. And I'm like, well, on the weekends, how about you go, it's free to go for a lovely bushwalk or the beach. Go to the beach. The beach is so grounding for these kids. To be able to walk barefoot in the sand, to be with nature, to be in the ocean makes a massive difference for these kids. So I encourage the parents. I said, even if you don't have a lot of time, put a picnic rug out at sunset, sit outside. The other thing is exposing your belly button to the sun. So I said, that's an amazing way of getting vitamin D. So if you're out in the backyard, make sure they're not wearing a shirt or they're exposing their belly button so they get the maximum impact from vitamin D.
Yeah, two things on that's interesting. So one, I had a kid in England that was stimming really, really bad. And I had talked to the mom. I said, hey, look, do me a favor and get your kid to the beach. And what I want you to do is try to get your kid out. These kids typically don't like sand initially because of their sensitivity to their feet. But I was like, I want you to try to get your kid out into the water, right? So saline actually helps with detoxifying, and our hands and the bottom of our feet are some of our, they're sweat glands, right? We sweat from our hands and our feet. So what happened is this mom literally, the kid didn't like the sand, so she had to pick him up and put him into the water. But what happened is he quit stimming. And when we work with kids with PANS and PANDAS and all these involuntary movements, we actually literally use warm water with salt in the bottom of it. And what we do is we actually help the body detoxify from the feet with the salt, and it actually reduces the inflammatory load and it calms the kid's brain down. So that's one benefit. But the interesting thing about the belly button to the sun is, the sun produces, we all can go out and get this, sunburn, right, from the violet light. And there's research that actually shows that violet light can actually kill pathogens and infections. And why the belly is so huge is because all of these kids on the spectrum, when you run stool samples, they all have lots of inflammation. For the scientists out there, caloprotectin levels, they're always elevated, which is an inflammatory marker. But what happens is you start to see that the more these kids are outside in the sun with their belly button to the sun, that their inflammatory markers actually start to reduce. And I read this one study. It was about these American gastroenterologists. They went to this village in Africa that they were living to like 100 years of age. And they were super healthy, no cancer, no diabetes. And they did is they gave them American food. They gave them candy bars, Fanta sugar, and they did pre and post stool samples. And what they were suspecting is they were going to get stuff like Clostridium overgrowth, inflammatory markers. And when they did the post stool sample, nothing changed. And it astonished these gastroenterologists because they're like, there's no way. But what happened is these guys, they walk around all day long without their shirts, right? So the sun produces this full spectrum light. Red is going to dampen inflammation. Violet is going to kill infections. So they're eating all these foods that would naturally cause stress and even cause fungal or even Clostridium overgrowth yeast. No changes. So,
That's incredible.
But you ask these parents about, do you take your kid outside and then you run blood work and you see their vitamin D levels are low? But yeah, it's a very free thing for parents to do is get your kid to a park, take your kids to the beach, take them to the forest, get them outside. But let's talk about this. So I had a parent one day that she showed me a video of her kid, and she says, look, this is a strange behavior. My kid can get on a merry-go-round, right, spin around, and he can go 200 times and still run straight. And she was like, this is pretty impressive, right? And I'm like, that's not good, right? You're supposed to get dizzy, but let's talk about how important the vestibular system is in these kids with autism.
All right, the vestibular system is designed to tell our brain exactly where we are in space. So for these kids, because their vestibular system, which is in our inner ear, is not firing so well, they don't have the sense of where they are in space, which is proprioceptive. So they find that this spinning, the parents think it's amazing that they can spin and not get dizzy, but we're supposed to get dizzy because getting dizzy tells our brain that this is what's happening when we can take the outside influence and get our brain to know exactly where we're in space. So when we spin a child and we're checking for vestibular system, what we want to do when we stop, we should see the eyes moving rapidly. All of these kids that are autistic don't have that. They don't get dizzy. They spin forever, and they find that they're not getting the benefits of spinning like they should.
I tell parents this all the time. A yogi is obviously the most calm, collected person, right? Their house could catch on fire. They wouldn't even faze them. They're okay. And what happens is the equilibrium, right? So this nerve is called the vestibular cochlear nerve. It fires into this really incredible part of the brain called the cerebellum, which I want us to talk about next. And what the cerebellum does is it releases this chemical to the brain called GABA. And GABA is a neurotransmitter that calms the brain down. So the better that these kids balance and their equilibrium gets, the better they can actually self-regulate itself. So let's talk about the cerebellum.
Right.
Okay. And let's just kind of pick, because, I know that if parents go to Google right now and they type in autism in the cerebellum, they're going to see a lot of stuff, right? They're going to see that the cerebellum is always underdeveloped. And let's just talk about the cerebellum.
So the cerebellum is so important in getting a child from going to doing from a baby up to upright and walking. The cerebellum tells the brain where you are in space, what's happening. It gives your brain an indication, like a compass of what's going on. A lot of these kids that come in, their balance is off center. They can't walk straight. They're not doing really well because the cerebellum isn't firing like the way they should. The other thing about the cerebellum not firing well, it's exhausting, because the way development is, all these things develop at a certain degree for efficiency. So we need to know that once we're standing up, we know exactly where we're in space, that we're standing upright. Well, if your cerebellum isn't firing, then it's a lot of work and a lot of energy for you to keep you upright.
So I'll hit the functional medicine people that are out there listening from blood work. So we run this incredible neurological panel, and a lot of these kids, when we run labs, we're seeing inflammation to the cerebellum, which is actually this area that, as you mentioned, it's going to kind of deal with calibration, processing, controlling muscle tone. But the other thing that we also see is Purkinje cells. We're seeing inflammation to this. So these Purkinje cells, they're these incredible cells inside of the cerebellum, and it releases GABA. And GABA is the chemical that's going to keep the brain calm. So when I started doing some research, what happened is there's something called molecular mimicry, which is where the immune system can start to attack itself. And what happened is I was looking at the DNA tissue of the cerebellum and the DNA tissue of gluten, right? There's this whole thing about gluten, right? Gluten-free diets. And, a lot of parents, some people say that it changed their kids' lives. Some of them say that they went on a gluten-free diet. It didn't. I have some answers to that. But what's happening is if a child has a sensitivity, which means their body has an adverse reaction to this food, the immune system, because they share similar DNA tissue, it can actually go to the cerebellum and it can actually attack it. And it could actually cause physical weakness. So you can see these kind of kids whenever they can't hop, right? When they walk, they don't symmetrically swing their arm. They have poor gross motor skills, even poor fine motor skills. And a lot of times they go to these great PTs and OTs and they can't get the desired results that they're looking for. And a lot of times it could actually be an underlying issue like a gluten sensitivity, or this food has actually went to this area of the brain and it started to basically attack it. And it could even cause some either inflammatory issues or even autoimmune diseases.
Yeah. I think with the cerebellum as well, the number of kids that come in that can't ride bikes. The parents say that they don't have the ability to balance on a bike because the cerebellum isn't firing well. The other thing we notice is that once we start to laser the cerebellum and get the cerebellum firing like it should, the sense of balance improves out of sight. And this makes a massive difference for sports. Like I find my parents coming and going, oh, wow, at sports, they're doing so much better. They can balance. One of my kids that came in, mum said they had twins. And the one that's coming in is the one with underdevelopment. Now, she's never ridden a bike because she couldn't balance, she couldn't do any of that. And once we started working on her, the mum was surprised because she just jumped on the bike and started riding, because her brain could perceive where she is in space. And that makes a massive difference for motor control, for motor balance, and it gives them the ability to do things that they couldn't before. Because if you can't balance, it makes life really tough. If you can't balance and you can't do sports like it should because your brain's not firing and you're not able to coordinate muscle function, it's a massive difference for these kids.
Well, let's talk on that, because I know these parents, I'm glad you brought this up. let's talk about the postural tone and how, if a parent really runs their finger down their child's back, specifically the lower back, they're going to notice that there's differences in the muscle tone. Like one side's going to be tighter than the other side. And how can that contribute to, the kid not being able to hop or stand on one leg or even ride a bike?
Okay, because we see the kids, and that's the unevenness of tone with the sides. We find that when we do our examination, we'll find they can't do a one-leg stand, or one side's weaker than the other, and that relates to the brain and how that part is not firing like it should, is underactive. So they can't stand on one leg. They can't do the things that they normally should. So they have this really uncoordinated balance. You find that we watch how they walk, their gait. They might be swinging one leg more than the other. The tone, there's a massive difference in tone, as you said, in their back, but we also see a weakness in their legs. Like quite often we find if that happens, we'll find that the one leg is swinging in more than the other. So when they're walking, they have this awkward gait. They're clumsy because their brain can't figure out where they are in space.
Yeah. So we have a few minutes left, but let me just go and do this. So for parents out there listening, I'll kind of give you a couple of kind of hacks, some things that I like to do. So one of my favorite supplements to use for kids on the spectrum is one thing. It's called methylene blue. It's an incredible thing that can basically help out with reducing inflammation. Another thing that I've seen crazy, incredible results with is something called oxaloacetic acid, right? So oxaloacetic acid, there's what it is this acid that basically can downregulate voltage-gated calcium channels and excessive glutamate. So glutamate's this chemical in the brain that fires. We're seeing a lot of glutamate when we run labs. And then the other thing, as Dr. Jeanne mentioned, which is incredible, primitive reflexes are amazing to do. And if a child's primitive reflexes are not integrating, then you might have to take a multiple sensory input. So maybe the face or even the eyes or maybe even the nose, right? Essential oils have to be stimulated simultaneously. So again, Dr. Jeanne, I appreciate, you flying all the way from Australia to Dubai to do this podcast with me. So what I want you to do real quick is to talk about your book, right? Your book is amazing for kids.
Thank you. So what I wanted to do was when the kids were coming in, I was finding that there was nothing out there that could give them hope. So I wanted to give hope to these kids and to know that whatever they're going through, it doesn't have to be forever. So I wrote this book called Ollie the Octopus and His Magnificent Brain, because we've got a fantastic mural that's Ollie the Octopus. With each of the characters that are in my book, they have a specific retain reflex. We have Stormy the starfish who has meltdowns, but when we start working on his moral reflex, we find that he's a lot calmer. All kids know that dolphins are intelligent. So I created Daisy, the dyslexic dolphin, because kids know that the dolphins are intelligent. But when they meet Daisy in the book, they realize that, hey, Daisy can't read. So she clowns out in class. She acts up. She's not learning like she should. And in the end of the book, she starts to read. So this is to give the kids hope. Because what happens when they read the book is they identify with an animal and they go, oh, that's me. And then when they go through the book, as we see the changes that happen, when we have Dr. Kyle as a scuba diver helping them, doing the exercises in the ocean, they find that there is hope. And that's such an important message. And in the book, I do include exercises for primitive reflexes. But my biggest message is that it doesn't have to be forever.
Okay. This is and I want to kind of end with this, and then I want you, before we finish up, to just make sure that you disclose, how to reach out to you. But for the parents that are watching this, which, by the way, I want to give my, love, and outreach to you, because, we work with these families.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
Just what would be a lasting message that you want to get out to these parents that are going to watch this about what the future of their kids' lives potentially look like?
I think you never set any limits. You always look for hope, because the brain's neuroplastic and nobody knows. I think hope is such an important thing to focus on. If you have a nonverbal autistic child, what I tell my parents is that I want you to hear their voice in your brain. I want you to hear their voice, to feel it, to see what that feels like, to have a future, because you don't need to accept the limitations. The brain is neuroplastic.
Yep. Look, so again, thank you so much for coming out. My staff loves you. You
thank
have
you.
such a brilliant amount of energy and love. So for parents that are listening to this, how can someone reach you?
So my Instagram handle is Nurturing Brain Potential. So if you start to follow that, you'll find stories that we do in our centre, and you can always message me.
All right. So Dr. Jeanne, thank you so much, for your time and this podcast, which I've been waiting to do for years.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing. It's been an amazing trip, and your team in Dubai, they're just brilliant. They're phenomenal. It was such a pleasure to meet them.
Thank you. So again, for all the parents out there that listen to this, we hope that, this really gives you hope. We decided to do this for you to hopefully give you some answers. And then how can someone find your book?
So Ollie the Octopus and His Magnificent Brain is available on Amazon. It's available at Booktopia. Oh, I think that's gone down. Barnes & Noble. So if you just Google Ollie the Octopus and His Magnificent Brain, you'll find that. And it was meant to help these kids.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And to all the people that are listening, we just ask that you just share this message to anyone, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a colleague, even as a therapist or a doctor. Our whole goal here is to change the whole entire world and help these kids find their voice.
Absolutely. It's just amazing when you hear that child speak, when you see the changes in them and you see their faces light up. You change not just the child, you're changing the village around them.
That's an incredible message. So thank you guys for listening. We hope that you shared this podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to be on the podcast with you.